Oh, realized I was talking muted. We'll go ahead and get started. There's no issues. I just started the recording, but guess we'll go ahead and get started then. So, yeah, welcome to the December 19th Carpenter Working Group. As far as updates go, we're starting pretty light. I think the only update, at least from our side, is that we have started doing the community triage sessions. So we did a couple of those last week, both for the upstream repo and for the AWS provider. So that's just going through open PRs, going through issues, having a more dedicated meeting to go through that with the community. So those recordings are available if you missed it and want to check that out. And we do plan on holding these regularly. We're probably not going to be holding one next week due to the holidays, and we'll communicate on Slack when we plan on hosting the next one. So that's really all we have on the agenda for today so far. Does anyone else have any announcements from maybe any of the other providers that they wish to give?
I'm here from Azure. I don't think I have any announcements to go over today, but just watching the doc get updated with my name twice. The I did have one issue that I want to just like highlight that I opened in the upstream repo. It's mostly looking at, I think it's been adjusted to be a feature request, but trying to get moving toward, I can link it in the chat. Basically looking at supporting budgets and asynchronous drift and stuff like that for the Azure provider. Pretty sure that we're gonna need a change within upstream as well. So I kind of detailed the case. This was something that when we were going through basically looking at testing the supportive budgets and things like that, we ended up noticing that it wasn't actually kind of working as described. And Azure, its provider, has a slightly different flow. We're open to adjusting that flow, but there are still like some requirements within that even with some adjustments, I think are going to require some upstream changes. So kind of put that out in the open to start that kind of process and conversation and stuff like that. So yeah.
Okay, yeah, so I know so starting out, this is a known bug. Is this specifically like the interaction between it and Azure, or does
Yes.
this affect any provider?
So this is specifically between it and Azure. It's something that there's a little conversation down below that reframed it as a feature request instead. The main reason why I initially listed it as a bug was just because from the I had been involved in the kind of design side of budgets and stuff like that. Like I had reviewed some different stuff, and from the documentation and design side, I expected it was going to align and work with Azure directly. But when it actually came to the code implementation, it doesn't support for the Azure scenario. So that's why I listed it initially as a bug. I'm fine with it being reclassified as a like feature request or whatnot. But that's why the initial classification was there.
Okay, got it. Yeah, I don't know if there's anyone on the call from our side who has taken a close look at this yet. I know it looks like Jonathan has. I don't know if anyone
Yeah.
else has,
I can give a little
but
update on the status in my mind for it.
mhm.
Basically from talking to I think Jonathan's the main one that I was like kind of had that little bit of back and forth with there. Um Basically, so the kind of issue here is that the model that Azure provider is currently using is we have long running operations in the Azure like cloud, which
Mhm.
means that when we end up going and provisioning, like making the VM requests to Azure, we end up watching on that long running operation to see about any potential failures and stuff like that before reporting back to core. This is something that I've tested removing the polling. And if you remove the polling on that long running operation, then the multi like asynchronous drift like works just fine. But the kind of reason why it's not working is because upstream core, like the core provider or the core like code ends up waiting until that provider ID comes back, which it doesn't come back until that call.
Hmm.
Um, Basically from the Azure side, we're like currently at least the like Azure provider and the conversations that I've had over there, um, currently we're like open to the idea of like adjusting or trying to adjust that to get the like call return faster or something like that, removing that polling, but we don't want to be ignoring those errors for the registration TTL, because the registration TTL is like 15 minutes unadjustable. And basically for those errors, we still do want to have them handled before that registration TTL would come about. So I was thinking about like the possibility of having some way to signal back those like failures, like Azure could still end up like watching for the failures, still do the fast return, which gets like that sort of behavior from the budgets and the drift get supported, but then still have some way to signal back if there has been a failure, and clean up before the registration TTL. That's one like approach I was thinking about. Not saying that's the
Hmm.
only approach. But the one thing with the conversation with Jonathan that I was having is he was wondering what some of those errors directly are. It's a little hard, to be fully transparent, it's a little hard to collect all of the different errors that it could be. But it's something that I am looking to try and get a better like understanding or collection of the errors, because there's the like errors that initially ha can initially happen during the direct like request to create the VM, and then there's also the errors that can happen on the long running operation. So trying to get a better data collection of that is what from my end I'm trying to handle right now. Uh, it's still something from the conversations I've had in Azure. We still do want to be handling those,
Hmm.
the long running operation errors before that registration TTL of 15 minutes. Um, but I'm still trying to collect that data, is basically kind of
Okay.
where it's at the moment.
Got it. So basically, like right now, this is all handled in the launch path, like before being able to return the provider ID.
Yes.
And
Yep.
like one of the potential solutions would be launch path returns provider ID immediately, but you have
Yep.
this asynchronous mechanism to track launch failures and maybe
Yes.
interact with the liveness controller somehow.
Exactly. Yeah,
Okay.
so initially when I found out that it wasn't working as expected, I think back when budgets was actually like first raised, which was back in like spring or something like that.
Hmm.
There were a few delays towards actually this being kind of in the backlog, so it wasn't quite surfaced back again until recently. But at that time, from the Azure side, I was looking at handling it 100% from the Azure side, if possible,
Hmm.
by just removing this polling. And like I said, I was able to get the behavior, but then I got pushback on the kind of Azure side of like the conversations and stuff like that, that like we still do want to be handling it. So there's some sort of, um, yeah, something that needs to be kind of, I think, or something that would be good to be like figured out or kind of triaged within that interaction.
Okay.
I guess quick question here. So, like, when you say long running errors that could happen, are we talking about like kubelet errors, or is that just specific to Azure and uh, the actual
Yeah.
infrastructure?
Yeah, so it's so the long run it's that's a great question. That's some of the data that I'm trying to collect a bit more, is what that more, even if we don't have a complete list of what all the errors could be, try and at least come up with some of the like frequencies or stuff like that of different things. But the basically like within the provisioning on the Azure provider side, we go and create like the required network component things. We go and create the like virtual machine itself, and we go and like end up applying a VM extension on top of that. And basically all of those, we do the initial like put request to Azure, which can have errors returned on that. And then internally within like the Azure actual like service provider for those different like components, it will be performing a long running operation that will like be actually doing that create or doing that um like adjustment. And then there can possibly be failures in there for different reasons. which are dependent upon multiple different factors. Um, and those are the errors that if we remove the like watch or remove the pulling, we would end up kind of losing track of. Which like that's the one that I'm trying to collect a complete list more of, if that makes sense. But yeah. So I don't have a specific answer to your question. I have the category of like it can be more broad, kind of. But yeah.
Yeah, because at least on the AWS side, we have seen these kinds of errors where whether it's like customer misconfiguration with the
Hmm.
provider, with the AWS providers, like maybe it's like security group networking or some security group configuration, misconfiguration, and we just end up seeing that the node never joins. But it
Yeah.
sounds like you guys are like, at least from the Azure side, there is uh, it sounds like there's another mechanism to actually give you a better signal to that I guess gives you a better signal of that the node isn't actually, or that instance or that VM is not healthy uh from just the actual from the cloud, as opposed to if from the cloud provider, as opposed to just waiting some 15-minute time frame.
Yeah, that I think so. I'm not like that's the thing again that like I definitely need to like dig in and try and get like these classifications of errors and like I'm totally down. Like, I think that that makes a lot of sense to like really know exactly the next steps to kind of approach it from.
Mhm.
But it's like when I initially looked at just like, can we remove this? I got like from the conversations from Azure of like, we need to be handling this. I wish I could answer a little bit more on like exactly what all of those categories to handle are. But that's what I'm working on next for it.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think there is also an interesting larger conversation here around like asynchronous instance launch, because I know that's something that I think the CAPI provider, like there was also interest expressed for that.
Hmm.
Because I mean, right now it's definitely valuable for us to have it synchronous. That way we can resolve the details for an instance for subsequent. Like the reason we have the wait and cluster sync is so we can resolve all of those details
Yep.
and know what we're scheduling against in subsequent scheduling simulations.
Yep.
But definitely an interesting conversation to
Yeah.
have and see what the use cases are, how
Yeah,
we can
and
maybe
that's
remediate that.
yeah, and that's I think a bit of like I was talking about, I was kind of involved in trying to at least and not all of the like budget conversations, but like trying to at least keep up on kind of the design conversations that were going on there and like the requests for comments that were happening around some of that. But that's where I kind of assumed from some other models that I've been aware of with like basically within within like AKS we have some other concepts of like trying to do this like asynchronous sort of things and I thought from just the like design side I was assuming that it was going to be more asynchronous, not this like synchronous with fast return, but we allow to do up to a budget like allotment.
Mhm.
Anyways, yeah, so that is another approach. I was assuming that part wouldn't shift, but if that would actually shift so we could do things directly asynchronous, then that would be another like angle of approach.
Yeah, yeah, because I think this issue is really more specific than just budgets. It
Yeah,
is how we have our scheduling simulation gated on the progress, basically like all of the details from the previous scheduling simulation being able to be resolved, being able to
yeah.
collapse these node claims with a whole bunch of options into a single option before we proceed and try and schedule more.
Hmm. Yeah.
But yeah, I don't think we'll have an answer here, but
Yep,
definitely an interesting
I
conversation to start.
I don't think we will either. Mostly just trying to surface it to like awareness and start the conversations.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. All right. I think if we don't have anything more to go on there, right now still nothing else in the doc. So I don't know any RFCs, any issues, anything anyone wants to bring up.
Hey, this is Reed with EKS. I just had the one RFC for the degraded status condition for node pools. Still in progress. There's a couple other approaches that I wanted to add to it, but just raising awareness here that I've started this.
I guess, do we want to talk maybe some high level context what this is?
Sure thing. So kind of related to the previous conversation, there are some scenarios for which there are misconfigurations that can exist, where Karpenter, for example, will never be able to launch a node that successfully joins a cluster. And so what this is seeking to do is seeking to at least create some mechanism by which we can communicate these kinds of failures to customers, to people using these clusters. Currently, there's no plan for it to affect the functionality of node pools. One idea thrown around early is that it could maybe affect the weight of a node pool, but for now, it is only looking to improve the observability of failures for cluster users. So for example, if I have a node claim come up using node pool A and it fails for any reason, it could be launch, could be registration, save that information on the node pool and show that a node failed to launch for a given node pool. I guess the other side of it too is then propagating some of this through on labels for certain metrics. So people can actually go in and filter those metrics for maybe it's pod unbound latency. And was a pod unbound for a certain amount of time because of a Karpenter issue or because we were attempting to schedule it to a node that would never join a cluster?
Yeah, so I think like for our use case for AWS, there's a whole bunch of different networking configurations and such that customers can configure that make it so that even if your Carpenter configuration, like your EC2 node class, your node pool, all of that is correct, the node still can't join. Like simplest example being there's no IPs available in a subnet.
Right, or the only valid subnets are within a single zone, and that zone has some network access control list that prevents communication in the VPC coming from that zone. Like those nodes will never be available.
So yeah, basically just observability for this larger class of errors that is caused by something outside of Carpenter's configuration that we can't necessarily reason about. Yeah, I think there's nothing else there. I guess any questions or feedback? See, Garvin, you went on camera. You have anything?
I need to read the RFC to see, but that sounds pretty good to have this new status or condition, I guess.
Yeah, it may end up just being there's a couple options I have yet to add to it after I've talked with a couple other people over here, and could be a status condition, it could just be a status, but more or less something that we can use to add a dimension to our metrics. And then we're not actually going to take away metrics. This would be an additional thing that can be filtered for once it's in CloudWatch, Grafana, whatever way you want to look at your metrics.
Are you able to differentiate between a no class issue or a no pool issue? You know what I mean?
Yeah, so there's kind of one of the things I was thinking about is it's kind of hard to tell when something out of Carpenter is updated that could affect a node pool or a node class. So for example, like a node class and for a node pool with its subnets being given to it from the subnet selector, and then those subnets without even touching the cluster are configured elsewhere in like the AWS console, for example. So for that, one of the additional approaches that I'm going to be updating is more or less, rather than have a status condition and trying to create some heuristic around whether or not we're able to successfully launch nodes for a given node pool, and then a node pool having a one-to-one cardinality with a node class. The other option would be, rather than trying to just reason about current state or like history, just have we ever, for a node pool with a node class, launched a node successfully? And if we have, then we know that, okay, at some point in time, this was valid. And then if we see a failure later and nothing else has changed, or the generation of the node pool and node class is the same, or maybe the node pool is pointing to a different node class, we're able to have some sort of history on the node pool of what we know is able to work versus something that won't. So if someone created a node pool and it was never valid from the get-go, we've never successfully launched a node, and those kind of latency metrics can then be filtered.
See, yeah, that'll be interesting. I don't know how you keep track of history, but that's something I always kind of wanted, if that's possible. Like similar to how like deployment you can kind of keep track of changes going through. In no pull and no claims, you kind of have the hash. If we can keep track of like these are the last 10, and then at this point they start failing, that'd be great. I don't know how doable that, how much scope that increases, but that'll be a nice to have for sure.
So the idea for that approach is, so far, again, I still need to upload it, but we basically, like we have a list of resources on the node pool, we could have a list of launches, which is effectively a hash of the node pool with its node class. So it'll show you a combination of things for which we have successfully launched in the past.
Okay. Okay. I think that makes sense. Yeah, that's all the question I have.
Unless there is anything else, I think we can probably open the floor up again for any other issues, questions.
Question. I'm not sure if anyone has questions, but what was the status of the node overlay PR? It seems like it lost traction somewhere along the line. I was wondering where that went.
So I think the RFC did end up getting closed, and it probably needs to be reopened because
Yeah, I'm pretty sure I reopened it earlier this week.
did you? Okay. Oh, not ODCR. Wait, sorry, did you say ODCR or node overlay?
Node overlay.
Okay. I've got one thing in my head, and okay, so yeah, I see it reopened. Yeah, we're still pursuing it. I don't know if there's any development updates to give though.
Okay.
Okay. Anything else? All right. If not, I think we can probably go ahead and end this early and see y'all at the next Karpenter working group. Thanks for coming.